Thanks for joining in and staying with us. This is Mame, and this is Independent Voice. It's evening there, so good evening, Graham. Thank you so much for coming back again. It's been a while since you and I have done this, and I'm so glad that we get to do this again. So welcome to Independent Voice once more. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. It's very nice to see you.
Same here. So I reached out to you again to talk about the recent article that you put out and you shared about From Excess to Simplicity of Living and Social Justice. Tell me, what was the motivation behind it?
Okay, well, it was a slightly odd piece, actually. I mean, sometimes when I start writing something, it's particularly something like the piece that you're talking about. It didn't have a clear framework to begin with. Funnily enough, I started talking about spirituality, and that was because there's so much nonsense spoken about the subject. And so that was the beginning. And then as I got into the piece, then I'm always trying to take, if I'm writing about something which we might call broadly philosophical, then my nature is quite philosophical, but then I try to, there's no point in philosophy for its own sake, really. So, but how I'm trying to relate those philosophical ideas to the world in which we live. And as I then got into the piece, and then, you know, sometimes these articles, they sort of guide you when you're writing them. And then the divisions in the world became the sort of undercurrent of the article. And I could see that, okay, well, you know, whatever we might understand by the term spiritual, I would started to think about it in terms of values. And, you know, we live in an incredibly divided world where there's very little social justice, very little freedom, really. And so I would say that those things are the opposite of what we might think of as spiritual. And that if we're going to deal with the problems in the world, which are immense, and I mentioned in the piece that, you know, the most significant problem is the environmental emergency, then it seems to me it's impossible to deal with these things unless the underlying attitudes and ways of thinking and values that we hold, unless that changes. And that, you could argue, means that actually the environmental crisis, the crisis of poverty and displacement and armed conflict and so on, is actually a spiritual crisis. In the sense, not a religious crisis, but in the sense that it relates to our attitudes about ourselves and other people and the world in which we live. And if we're going to deal with any of those things and survive, you know, the environmental crisis is, you know, it's a question whether we survive now. It's, you know, if we are on track for 4 degrees of warming, lots part of the world will be completely uninhabitable. So you'd have massive, hundreds of millions of people displaced, massive immigration, you know, terrible hardship and so on. And it's driven, the environmental crisis is driven by consumerism. It's all about consumerism, and it's about Western developed countries and their insatiable appetite to consume stuff. And that's to do with a value system. You know, it's what do we care about? Do we care about, you know, our own individual lives, or do we care about the well-being of the community and the world at large? But that's a spiritual choice. And I think you know, what all the time we're tinkering, or the politicians and we're tinkering with the effects They try to manipulate the effect. I remember listening to, there was an interview with John Kerry some time ago with the BBC about the environmental crisis. And he was trying to argue that Americans, who consume more than everybody, and have the highest levels of greenhouse gas emissions per capita by far, they always point to China, but it's actually, it's America and Western nations. And the reason China has such high greenhouse gas emissions, one of the main reasons, is that they make everything for the West. It's their manufacturing industry is largely producing stuff which is exported to the West. Most, in America and Britain and large parts of Europe, we don't have a manufacturing base anymore. We've exported that to Southeast Asia and China in particular. And Kerry was arguing, well, that people could continue to live as they do, and we could at the same time deal with the environmental crisis, which is complete nonsense. So you can have your cake and eat it. They're so locked into a socioeconomic model, which is based on consumerism. And so that needs to fundamentally change. We need to really rethink the way the socioeconomic and political system is structured, and create an environment in which people aren't competing with each other all the time, where there's greater levels of cooperation, where this extreme nationalism, which is based on competition and the survival of the fittest, and this dog eat dog mentality which has been adopted and promoted, if we change that, if we start to rethink that and say, okay, well, maybe there's another way of living. Maybe we don't have to live like this. Maybe, we have in the West mental health epidemics. It's, I work, part of the work that I do in London is with civil societies, with a charity here. And I see, yesterday I was working with homeless people all day, and I think I saw 8, 9 people who needed advice, and they all had mental health issues. And that's the extreme. But I don't know, everybody suffers from anxiety or depression or something more serious, because they're living under constant colossal pressure, to pay the rent, to pay the mortgage, to meet some level of expectation which has been projected onto them by the society in which they've lived, by their parents, by the education system, and so on. And all of that creates division. So people aren't, so they're not, this is talking very generally. Of course, there are lots of people in the world who are kind and not so selfish and are actively working for the benefit of others. But everybody is living within this atmosphere which cultivates, it's based on, I believe, a false understanding of the nature and the purpose of life. It's an ideology which flows from the idea that you're in this world, you only live once, which the whole of the Western world would disagree with, to start with. You only live once, and have as much fun, get as much stuff, accumulate as much wealth as you can in that period. Have as much pleasure as you possibly can. That pleasure normally derives around sensory pleasure. So, that's a crude dissemination of the ideology, but it's broadly true.
Right.
And that is injected into people virtually from the time they're born. This conditioning starts from the moment they're born, really.
It's interesting how what you're saying connected to spirituality or spiritualism. The bottom line for me, and the reason why this piece resonated with me so much, is because in speaking of consumerism and anything and everything is available to anyone and everyone, if there is a consumer, there is a seller, right? You talked about a reflection back onto oneself, looking at the consumerism, Anything and everything is out to be consumed. And like I said, if there is a consumer, there is a seller. Anything is out for anybody to grab and consume. And because of that, I think we're facing moral degradation, the value of life itself, the impact, even though we're talking about it from a general aspect of it, it really has a greater impact on life itself. And because of that degradation of the value of life itself and the division that we're talking about, we continue to see atrocities happen. We continue to see this selfishness happen, and the loss of the value of life itself, and just not being able to see past self when you destroy somebody else's life. I mean, whether it's their livelihood or life itself, we see a lot of it still happening in the world of Africa, particularly we're talking about Ethiopia. And I don't even know how I connected this piece to what is happening in Ethiopia, but you talk about consumerism, materialistic thing. And the way I was looking at consumerism and what I thought was being consumed a lot more lately is social media, and what social media is spewing out and how it's actually changing and altering our views about life. Is that too far-fetched from what you are looking at, or is it a fair connection to the general sense of what it is you're looking at?
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't thought about social media in it at all, but I think if the way people are living their lives is, if they're encouraged to think about themselves to the exclusion of others, then we are separate from one another. Mm-hmm. And so I know that, I remember the first time I went to Ethiopia to work, I was working with a group of underage commercial sex workers in Addis. I mean, the most awful lives. Mm-hmm. They'd all been cast out by their families. They'd all been raped a number of times. They were in their late teens, and now they were, having sex with, getting paid nothing, with men who wouldn't use condoms, so HIV and unwanted pregnancies, the risk was very high. Anyway, I didn't speak the language. I don't speak Amharic, so that's a huge barrier. But I remember sitting with one of the girls one day, having a discussion with her, a conversation through a translator. And it suddenly became clear to me that her pain, mm-hmm. which must have been unbelievably deep, was to do with loss. She'd lost her family, her standing in society. She'd lost, bulk of her childhood. Mm-hmm. She'd lost any hope of a future and so on. So loss. Now, I know what loss feels like because I've experienced it in my own life in many ways. And so in that moment, there was a recognition that our lives were very different, but actually we were the same. Mm-hmm. And that's, and I've traveled a lot and worked with lots of groups all over the world, and we are all the same. Most human beings don't want much, really. They want a peaceful life. They want to have, security of where they're living, enough food for themselves and their families, and to live, a life where they're not under threat. So that consciousness, we have the same consciousness. It's the same. Now, obviously we're different and we might think slightly differently, but underneath that, we're all the same. Mm-hmm. So we are brothers and sisters of one humanity, mm-hmm. but we live in this divided way, that we don't trust each other. You have these tribal groups, whether they're actual tribal groups in Ethiopia and elsewhere, or whether they're nations, they're still tribal groups who are concerned about their own survival and their own success at the expense of the others. So if there was one thing that if there was just one thing that we could change, I think the most important thing would be to give rise to a sense of global unity. that humanity is one. Now, if I believe that you're my sister, you know, then I won't let you go hungry.
Right.
You know, and whether that's a child in Addis Ababa or, you know, one of the people that I was working with yesterday. Funnily enough, when I left the center yesterday, I cycled home, got to some traffic lights, and looked to the left, and there was a young woman sitting on the pavement, and it almost broke my heart. It was, I don't know why it did, but it so moved me. And she was rough sleeping, and we chatted for a while. And so now, if that were my daughter, you know, I wouldn't let that happen. But we do, as a society, we do let it happen. We walk past that girl, you know, and so if you could change that, if suddenly there's a sense of responsibility for one another, which is born out of an understanding that we are the same. You know, the only difference between her and I is that, you know, circumstances. It's the only difference, really. You know, I could be in exactly her position. Any of us could. Exactly. So if I know that, even if I mean, if you say brothers and sisters, maybe it has religious overtones, and I don't mean it to, but if we could engender a sense of responsibility for one another, you know, you could change. There's no reason for a single child to go hungry.
Right. Like, I'm my brother's keeper, or I'm my sister's keeper.
Exactly. And we are our brother's keeper. And there's, you know, if I'm not responsible for that woman, who is? There isn't anybody else. It's so the only reason people starve is because countries won't share what they have. You know, I remember reading something years ago in India. They had huge warehouses full of rice, and it was cheaper for the government to let the rats eat the rice or burn it than it was to distribute it amongst, you know, the 600 million people who are living in destitution in India. And the same in you know, in Africa. And it's you know, during the famines in Ethiopia, people starved, not really because of lack of food, but because of lack of money.
Right.
We've got the food.
Right.
If we shared it, or if we distributed it, not just the food, but the water and the knowledge and the natural resources, the skills, you know, all the wealth that humanity has, if that was shared equitably amongst the peoples of the world, and shared because we have a recognition that we have a duty to one another to look after one another, you would completely change the atmosphere in which people are living. And that sense of, you know, for people to live contented, peaceful, harmonious lives, I think that our nature is to be at peace. It's, if you identify the causes of the conflict and take them away, there will naturally be peace.
So what do you think, and how, and I know this is probably a bigger question, but what do you think contributed to where we're at right now? It seems to me we're more of an individualized or individualistic kind of perception and mindset that we have. What contributed to this notion? And what do you think will get us out of at least try and say, well, we were never meant to be this way. We've gotten to be this way. What is it that we need to do to not necessarily go backwards, but at least go to the basics or return to that value that maybe generations had before for the value of life? What do you think?
It's all about conformity. It's about a sort of distorted, appropriated form of individuality. You know, you can be an individual, but you have to be an individual within a certain constraints. It's, you know, there's no avant-garde, for example. I don't know in the States, but certainly in Europe, there's no avant-garde within the art movements. Everything is assimilated within the gallery system. because everything is seen as a commodity.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like I said in the piece, everything is a commodity and everybody is seen as a consumer or a potential consumer. And then you could add to that, and every place, town, city, village, country is seen as a marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
So it's their marketplaces, Ethiopia, Uganda, the African nations, they're seen as, their potential is as potential marketplaces for Western crap. And Western ideas, and Western culture. Colonialism has changed its face, but you have cultural colonialism. I don't think there's a great deal of individuality. I think individuality is seen as a tremendous threat, and the powers that be, with the ruling elites, the governments, the corporate media, they don't want individuality. They want to control people.
Right.
And it's easier to control people if they're all the same. So there's that. I think in terms of how to change it, I think there is a movement towards changing it.
Mm-hmm.
I do think we're living in many ways extraordinary times, and times of real transition. And it's a transition out of a civilization which is essentially broken into a different way of living. And there are lots of conversations like this taking place. I think there are lots of small groups trying their best to work in a cooperative way.
Right.
But the institutions and the ideologies under which we're all living are, if you like, those of the past. They're not adequate for the times at all. But we don't have new institutions and new ways of living yet. We have a recognition amongst many people that this way of living doesn't work. Mm-hmm. It's making people ill. I mean, physically and mentally ill. It's in countries like Ethiopia and India and other countries in Africa where development is, fermenting, shall we say. It's a real opportunity for these countries to look and say, okay, well, we don't want to be like the West, because that development model has failed. It's poisoned the planet to a point of, extreme level that we don't even know the degree of the problem really, and created societies of divided, unhealthy human beings. It's not a good way to live.
Right. So going back to your point of the collective mindset, initially when I had mentioned individualism, I was thinking of the whole individualistic approach, like me, myself, and I. All I care about is me and my interest. You're right. There isn't like a unified or individualistic stance, so to speak. Conformity is absolutely correct. I just wanted to highlight that. We're conforming to whatever it is being marketed to us, regardless of asking whether it's just for me, good for me, however bad it is for the person next to me, however bad it is to the society or the community or the family or that other person. It doesn't matter how it impacts others, as long as in some ways I'm conforming to it because it helps me or it benefits me, it makes me feel this type of way or that type of way. So that's what I was trying to get at. I wanted to read a very short portion from your piece, your article. It says, if, as a global community, we're to face the challenge of the time, which are immense, a fundamental change in approach is needed. A major shift in attitude and values and movement away from conditioned reductive patterns of thinking that focus purely on the self to inclusive ways of living that promotes cooperation and unity. A change leading to systemic redesigns that inculcates what we might describe as the spiritual in the individual and by extension in the wider group that we'll call humanity. I think that paragraph is so powerful to me because it really touches. If we're going to really consider the bigger picture that we're talking about, and you're saying a major shift in attitudes and value and movement away from conditioned reductive patterns of thinking that focus purely on the self to inclusive ways of living that promotes cooperation and unity. Say more about that.
So society isn't separate from the individuals that live within the society.
Mm-hmm.
So we live in a violent, divided world because the individuals who live within that world are violent and divided. So that is an expression of the consciousness of humanity, or wherever we are.
Mm-hmm.
So what needs to change? It's why the politicians, everything they do fails.
Mm-hmm.
And it consistently fails because they don't change. They haven't changed. What they try to do is manipulate an existing system which doesn't work. There is no division between the society we live in and the people who inhabit that society. So if there's to be real fundamental lasting change, if we want to live in a peaceful world, we have to become peaceful. We don't have peace, not just internationally, we don't have peace within relationships. We don't have peace in families. We don't have peace within ourselves. People feel conflicted and angry, and they want this and they want that, and they're frustrated and so on. So how can you create a peaceful society if the individuals within it are in conflict? Mm-hmm. It's impossible. Mm-hmm. So now if you say, okay, Graham, we're going to, are you saying that for society to change, everybody within that society has to change? That would be impossible. And it's a symbiotic relationship. It's not if we live in a space which is more, if you live in an environment which is more conducive or less judgmental, mm-hmm. less critical, less competitive, if you work in that environment or live in that environment, you'll find that the people who live there or work there will relax a little bit more, and they will be then less judgmental and less competitive themselves. And in so doing, they strengthen the atmosphere of congeniality that is being created. So the two things work together. So it's very difficult at the moment because the systems that we're living under are not conducive to harmony. They create unbelievable stress for everybody. We've got in Britain at the moment enormous numbers of public sector worker strikes. So people are on strike because they've been exploited for years. They haven't had raises in wages, working conditions are awful, they're more and more insecure, and so on. If you create an employment contract with somebody where they're insecure, that doesn't just affect them in their workplace. Mm-hmm. They're insecure generally. So they're anxious, they're tense, they're not relaxed, they don't trust other people. So it strengthens the atmosphere of division in which people are living. So we need systemic change. We desperately need social, economic, systemic change. Neoliberalism is an absolute evil in the world, and it needs to be, to my mind, completely scrapped, but at least radically reformed. So that needs to happen, and there is talk about that. Starting, I read something today. The First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, there's a small collective of nations that have come together to talk about development in terms of well-being. So which seems so obvious, But it's a major step, and Scotland is one of them, Wales, New Zealand, Finland, I think. And one of the statements from her was, there is no question that we need fundamental reform of the economic system. So absolutely we do. It's what many of us have been saying for many, many years.
Yes.
So that needs to happen. I think, there is, even to be able to write a statement like I did, I think that in a sense shows that there is the space for those ideas. It's not seen as idealist anymore. I think more and more people are recognizing that if we are going to change this world and create any level of social justice and peace, we do need fundamental change. Right. It's impossible otherwise.
I don't want to say we're going backwards, but I think coming to the basics, the fundamental understanding, the fundamentals of humanity, that's what we're coming to and saying, hey, what happened to being content with what was good and good enough? Except I want more and more and more, because anything and everything is about consumerism. We're consuming without necessarily having to think about the future. Thanks for joining in and staying with us. This is Mame, and this is Independent Voice. Thank you.